The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Arlington West Cemetery, painting the marble headstones in hues of amber and gold. Henry Mallory, 85 years old and upright in a dark suit that no longer quite fit, stood motionless beside the flag-draped casket of his wife, Lillian. His knuckles were white from gripping the bronze crucifix she'd worn every day of their marriage, 57 years of shared mornings, quiet laughter, and hard-won peace. Around him, mourners whispered prayers and stifled sobs. The air smelled faintly of roses, cut grass, and gun oil. Lillian had wanted this, a military farewell, simple, dignified. Henry had promised her it would be so. A uniformed officer's voice shattered the stillness. "Sir, you're obstructing a restricted zone. Step back immediately." Henry turned, slowly, confused. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, and the weight of grief had dulled his senses. The officer, tall, young, and unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses, repeated the order louder. "This is a controlled area. Move now or be removed." Henry opened his mouth to speak, but his voice caught. The officer's hand twitched near his belt. A taser clicked. Then came the crackle, and a thin wire snapped forward, striking Henry in the chest. The crucifix fell first. Then Henry collapsed, his body jerking once before going still against the gravel path. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A woman screamed. Someone shouted, "Call an ambulance," but no one moved, shocked into stillness. The silence that followed was not reverent. It was the awful hush of something sacred being broken. Henry had not been stopped by time. His goodbye had been stolen, not by death, but by a badge too blind to see grief for what it was, love that refused to let go. And the crucifix, warmed by decades on Lillian's chest, lay forgotten in the dust. Henry Mallory had always lived just a step outside the spotlight. Born in 1939 in Durham, North Carolina, to a black mother and white father, he learned early what it meant to be seen yet invisible. His mother, Ruth, worked as a seamstress for the local theater. His father, Thomas, had been a streetcar mechanic who kept to himself, knowing silence often meant safety in a town carved down the middle by railroad tracks and skin color. Henry grew up in the segregated South where, separate but equal, meant broken swings, backdoor entrances, and being told what books he couldn't borrow. But books were his refuge. He consumed history with the hunger of someone searching for his own place in its margins, Lincoln's speeches, Douglas's writings, the Federalist Papers. At night, he lay under patchwork quilts listening to his father read Shakespeare in a Carolina drawl. By 13, Henry had memorized the Gettysburg Address and corrected his teachers when they misquoted King. He never raised his voice, he didn't need to. His eyes carried an intensity that made others listen even when he didn't speak. At 17, just as the Montgomery bus boycott began stirring change across the South, Henry lied about his age and joined the Navy. There, he found discipline, order, and something like fairness. The Navy didn't ask about the color of your skin when you were elbow-deep in engine grease or knee-deep in sonar diagnostics. He excelled quickly, becoming one of the first black sonar technicians during a time when even mess halls were unofficially segregated. His supervisors noticed his focus, his uncanny memory, and the way he spoke with the patience of a man twice his age. Vietnam came, and with it, chaos. Henry served on the USS Long Beach, tracking submerged threats in contested waters. He didn't carry a weapon, but he saved lives with calculations, detecting mines before they erupted and warning convoys of approaching danger. He saw friends buried at sea, watched fire rain from the sky, and wrote letters for men who knew they wouldn't make it back home. The Bronze Star arrived in a plain envelope. He never spoke of what earned it. During his second deployment, he met Lillian, a Navy nurse from Baltimore who had joined through the commissioned corps. She treated Marines in field hospitals and carried a steeliness behind her soft voice. They met in Saigon under a leaky tent, both wearing the same shade of fatigue. She stitched a cut on his cheek after a misfired deck hatch and asked why a sonar tech looked so haunted. He said, "I hear things nobody else does." She didn't laugh. That night, they talked until sunrise. After the war, Henry was offered a quiet post, escorting diplomats through Cold War territories. In Berlin, he learned to read coded behavior. In Tehran, he once sat 3 rows behind Kissinger and didn't blink once in 6 hours. But diplomacy was less satisfying than teaching. So when his second retirement came, he traded his dress uniform for chalk dust and returned to a city that still whispered about skin color when hiring schoolteachers. He taught American history at Langston High, a school with cracked windows, rusted lockers, and textbooks from the 70s. He brought in his own maps. He lectured like a statesman and demanded his students argue with him, respectfully, rigorously. Know your facts. Then break them open. He stayed late for students who worked jobs. He gave extra credit to those who brought in news clippings. He never raised his voice, but when he looked across a classroom and said, "You're better than this," students believed it. Lillian, meanwhile, fought her own battles. As a civil rights nurse, she helped establish mobile clinics in neglected black neighborhoods. She petitioned for better prenatal care, for black mothers ignored by hospitals. Together, they built a life centered around dignity and service. They had no children of their own. Lillian suffered 2 miscarriages early in their marriage, but they raised hundreds, the students who came back years later to say thank you, the patients who remembered Lillian's soft hands during pain. Their home, a modest brick house tucked between 2 gas stations, was filled with books, photos of historic marches, and handwritten letters from former students who now wore uniforms of their own, army green, police blue, academic robes. One framed note from a rear admiral simply read, "You taught me how to stand before I knew how to lead." In their final years together, Henry and Lillian sat on the porch each morning with coffee, reading the news aloud and shaking their heads in near silence. "We marched for this," she'd whisper some days, when the headlines were particularly cruel. But he'd just squeeze her hand and say, "Not just this. We marched for what still might be." When Lillian fell ill, she refused a hospital bed. "I've helped too many die under fluorescent lights," she told Henry. So he cared for her at home, carrying her to the bathtub, reading her Baldwin, brushing her hair each night. Her last words weren't dramatic. Just, "Promise me you'll bring me there." The ceremony. Arlington, West. And he had promised. Even as her hands grew frail and the morphine dulled her sharp wit, Lillian held on to that crucifix, the same one her mother wore at Selma, the same one Henry now gripped as if it still had the power to heal. When she passed, he bathed her himself, dressed her in the navy blue dress she wore to their wedding, and whispered, "I'll get you there. Even if it's the last thing I do." He meant it. Henry believed in vows, in duty, and in finishing what you start. He didn't expect applause. He only wanted to do right by her. But even after a life of service, after war, after classrooms, after decades of quiet heroism, he hadn't anticipated that the very ground he stood on would turn against him at the end. Not because he disobeyed, but because he simply refused to let go too soon. The funeral began as Henry had imagined it countless nights beside Lillian's hospice bed. He'd polished his shoes, ironed his suit, and rehearsed the steps in his head: arrive early, stay composed, give her the dignity she deserved. She had asked to be buried at Arlington West, among those who had served, not just because of her own nursing in Vietnam, but because she'd once told Henry, "They bury you neat there." With full attention. He had promised her neatness. Promised her attention. The morning sun rose bright and soft. Mourners came in clusters, former students, veterans, nurses who'd marched beside Lillian decades earlier. Henry greeted each one with a quiet nod, too fragile for small talk. The casket stood ready near a manicured patch of ceremonial gravel, flanked by 2 white-gloved members of the Navy Honor Guard. An American flag was draped perfectly over the polished wood. As the chaplain began to speak, Henry drifted a few steps forward. Not too far, just enough to see her name more clearly on the temporary marker. He hadn't cried yet, not once since she passed. Now, as wind stirred the hem of the flag, his lips moved in a whisper no one could hear. The crucifix in his hand trembled, gold against bone. Officer Lucas Brant spotted him from 30 feet away. A recent transfer from a private security firm contracted by Homeland Security, Brant had served briefly as military police but never saw combat. Arlington West, to him, was a site of procedure, not remembrance. His orders were to maintain uninterrupted flow, especially around restricted zones. The perimeter near the casket was considered one. He saw an elderly man step close. Didn't recognize the cane, the tremor, the grief etched in every inch of posture. "Sir," Brant called, briskly walking over. "You need to step back. This area's restricted." Henry didn't hear him at first. The words floated somewhere beyond his ears. He leaned closer to the casket, mouthing something, perhaps a line from the Psalms, perhaps Lillian's name. Brant repeated, louder, "Sir. Step back immediately. Final warning." Someone in the crowd turned. "That's her husband," a young woman whispered. Henry turned, finally registering the voice. His eyes were watery, his shoulders stiff. He opened his mouth to speak, just as Brant's hand shot toward his belt. There was a crackle. Then a pop. Two thin wires darted forward, striking Henry's chest. He convulsed. The crucifix flew from his hand. His legs buckled. He collapsed onto the gravel. Gasps surged through the mourners. A woman screamed. An elderly man cursed. Someone shouted, "Are you insane?" Brant stood motionless, taser still in hand. Subject was non-compliant, he muttered into his radio. A Navy officer stepped forward. "Stand down, sir. Now." An EMT in the crowd rushed forward, kneeling beside Henry, who twitched once more, then lay still. Blood trickled from his temple where he'd struck the ground. The funeral was frozen. The honor guard looked uncertain. The chaplain lowered his head. The woman who screamed began live streaming. Brant took a step back as murmurs turned to accusations. "That's Henry Mallory," someone hissed. "He's a vet." "Lillian's husband," another echoed. "He taught half this town's kids." The paramedics lifted Henry onto a stretcher. One of them, Sheila, gently pressed the crucifix into his palm. His fingers closed over it reflexively. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. By the time the ambulance doors shut, the story had already left the cemetery. And Lillian's ceremony, her final moment of honor, was left unfinished, eclipsed by static, stun wires, and silence. The flag still draped the casket. But the nation it stood for had just tossed one of its quietest, finest sons. The ambulance had just cleared the cemetery gates when the first unmistakable sound reached the crowd, a low, steady hum that grew into a mechanical roar. Heads turned upward. Out of the western sky came two UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, flying low and deliberate, their rotors slicing through the air like drumbeats of something imminent. At first, no one understood. Then, down the service road, came the unmistakable diesel growl of military transport trucks and two black SUVs. Arlington West, usually silent between ceremonies, now buzzed with the tension of an unscheduled arrival. The honor guard turned sharply as the vehicles slowed and stopped along the ceremonial path. Doors opened. Naval officers stepped out, high-ranking, formal, moving with calm urgency. And then she appeared. Rear Admiral Joanna Bain stepped from the lead SUV, her uniform crisp, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. She stood tall and composed, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. Her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, sorrow warped into suspense, then awe. Few recognized her at first. But Henry would have. He had taught her once, long ago, American history, second period, freshman year, Langston High. She had sat in the second row, always early, always prepared. When other students had dozed through lectures on civic structures, Joanna had asked about Reconstruction policy and the rise of imperialism. Now, nearly 4 decades later, she was the Navy's highest-ranking woman of color and the current commander of the Pacific Fleet. And Henry Mallory had once handed her a copy of Frederick Douglass's speeches and told her, "This isn't just history. It's blueprint." She moved quickly past the murmuring crowd, her eyes sweeping the scene. She saw the empty space where the ambulance had stood, the flag-draped casket, the stunned mourners still frozen in place. And then she saw it. The crucifix. It lay in the gravel again, just to the side of where Henry had fallen. In the rush of the paramedics, it had been dropped. A small gold cross on a delicate chain, dulled by time and dust but catching just enough light to be noticed. She bent and picked it up, brushing the dirt from its edges. Then, as if it pulled her forward, she walked to the center of the scene and turned to face the crowd. A low voice muttered, "Who is she?" "She's Navy," someone else answered. "That's a Rear Admiral's stripe." Joanna didn't wait for an introduction. She turned toward a group of cemetery officials huddled near the tent and spoke clearly. "Who's in charge here?" A middle-aged administrator stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Chief Coordinator Lansing. This wasn't scheduled." "I can see that," she said flatly. "And the man taken away?" Lansing stammered. "There was an incident, perimeter violation. Officer Brandt." "Where is he?" Brandt stepped hesitantly from the periphery, his expression a careful mask of professional detachment. "I gave clear orders," he began. "He refused to comply." Joanna raised a hand. "That man is Henry Mallory." A pause. The Henry Mallory. Bronze Star recipient. Vietnam sonar tech. Diplomatic escort. History teacher. Civil rights advocate. He taught me. Taught thousands. And today, while burying his wife, you tasered him? Brandt straightened. "I followed procedure." "No," she replied, her voice dropping in temperature. "You followed fear. Not judgment." She turned to the mourners. "I didn't come here for press. I wasn't notified. But I heard. And when I did, I came immediately." No one interrupted. Even the birds had gone still. Joanna stepped forward and addressed the honor guard. "Resume the ceremony. Now." The officers, unsure at first, glanced at each other, then one saluted, turned, and barked quiet orders. Movements resumed. Buglers reassembled. Rifles were readied for the final salute. Joanna walked over to the casket and placed the crucifix gently atop the flag. "For Lillian," she whispered. Then she looked out over the mourners and said, "This man, Mr. Mallory, built a generation of service. He built me." And when he stood still beside his wife's casket, it was not defiance. It was devotion. A few in the crowd wept. Others bowed their heads. Brandt shifted, uncertain. A young sailor stepped forward, removed his cap, and saluted the casket. One by one, others followed, officers, veterans, even civilians. No command was given. It simply happened. A human tide of silent, unified honor. A cameraman from a local station, already filming, whispered to his colleague, "You're getting this?" The feed went live within minutes. Viewers saw the Admiral. The crucifix. The salutes. Not the chaos, but the correction. The dignity restored. But inside the Admiral's mind, the storm hadn't passed. She looked out at a nation still tangled in reflexive suspicion. Still punishing the quiet ones. still needing a face like hers to remind them that worth doesn't always shout. Back inside her SUV, she would later call the Secretary of the Navy directly. She would not sugarcoat it. And when the Secretary asked what she saw that morning, she would say only, "A nation almost forgot one of its architects. But not today. Not on her watch." The ceremony resumed beneath a still thick tension, though the presence of Rear Admiral Baines seemed to settle the uneasy air. The Navy Honor Guard stood straighter. Their movements became more exact, more reverent. Buglers lifted their horns, and the clear, aching tones of taps once again echoed across the rolling cemetery hills. Henry was gone from the scene, but his spirit felt nearer than ever. Admiral Baines stood at the head of the gathering, her face stoic as the first volley of the 21-gun salute cracked through the afternoon stillness. White petals from nearby dogwood trees fluttered on the wind like confetti from another world. When the final note of taps faded, she turned to the flag team. With sharp, practiced folds, they tucked the stars and stripes into the perfect triangle. Baines took the flag in both hands, the crucifix still looped gently around one corner. She didn't move to present it yet. Instead, she faced the mourners. "Before I hand this over," she said, her voice projecting effortlessly, "I need to tell you who this flag is for. Not just Lillian Mallory, but the man who brought her here." The gathered crowd leaned in, hanging on each word. Henry Mallory was one of the first black sonar technicians in the United States Navy. That might sound clinical, technical. But it means he was one of the few trusted to listen into the deep when the world was at its loudest. It means he navigated waters filled with threats we never saw, and ensured ships returned home with names unspoken in the headlines. She looked around, letting silence hold for a beat. After the war, he could have faded into the crowd, like so many do. But he didn't. He taught. He didn't just teach facts, he taught integrity, conviction, history as something living, breathing. He taught me. I am standing here, not just because I outranked others who should have shown up, but because I remember the man who told me, "Don't serve the uniform. Serve the people inside it." Soft murmurs rippled through the group. Baines continued, "Today, this man was forcibly removed from his wife's funeral. He was tossed while holding a crucifix. While grieving. While honoring. Let that settle for a moment." Even Officer Brandt had lowered his gaze now, his face drained of righteousness. This is what happens when procedure outweighs perspective. When authority forgets humanity. Her eyes scanned the faces, young and old, uniformed and civilian. We're told to salute the flag. But what is a flag without the people who've suffered for it, carried it, folded it, or buried those who died beneath it? Henry Mallory isn't a name for a monument, he's a blueprint for dignity. And this, she lifted the flag, isn't a favor. It's a debt. She walked forward, the flag clutched tightly. Then, without waiting for ceremony, she turned toward the open path where a VA vehicle had just returned, and Henry, conscious but weary, sat propped inside, one arm hooked to and fore, his fingers still curling protectively around Lillian's cross. A low murmur spread as the crowd noticed him. Applause didn't erupt, it wouldn't have been right. But people straightened. Saluted. Removed hats. Faces softened with something purer than relief, recognition. Baines stepped up into the van, knelt beside him. "Mr. Mallory," she said, voice lowered now, full of something fierce and unshakable. "It's Joanna. Do you remember me?" Henry blinked. His mouth twitched, forming what might have been a smile. "Second row," he rasped. She laughed, eyes brimming. "Yes, sir. Second row." She placed the folded flag gently into his lap. "For Lillian," she whispered. He looked down, fingers brushing over the soft fabric. His voice came again, dry but clear. "I was just trying to hold her hand one more time." "I know," she said. "You did. Outside, a chaplain led a prayer. No one moved until it finished. Even Officer Brandt stood with his head bowed. He hadn't spoken since the incident, hadn't made excuses. But as he turned to leave, a Navy captain stepped in his path. "You're not dismissed," the captain said. "Wait here." Within the hour, Brandt's credentials were revoked. He was escorted from the grounds, not in disgrace, but in silence. He wasn't charged, Henry asked for none of that. But his assignment was over, his presence unwelcome where reverence still mattered. By late afternoon, the media had swarmed. Local and national reporters pieced together the story: war hero tasered at wife's funeral. News vans lined the road outside the cemetery, anchors speaking in solemn tones. But they all missed the moment that really mattered. A small group of mourners, now lingering after the crowd dispersed, kneeling to place white flowers around Lillian's headstone. A child, maybe 7, asked his mother, "Who's Henry?" And she answered, "A man who never gave up loving." That evening, the footage went viral. Not just the taser incident, but the speech, the salutes, the admiral kneeling beside the van. Hashtags trended. Civil rights leaders called for a review of private contractors at federal cemeteries. Congress took notice. By week's end, an inquiry had begun. Letters of apology arrived. Veterans groups rallied. Students, former and current, wrote letters to Henry from all over the country. But Henry didn't care for fanfare. When asked by a reporter for a statement, he said only, "I did my job. And I loved my wife. That's all." Recognition came, not loud or forced, but sure. The kind that doesn't burn out in news cycles but stays, etched into those who watched a nation pause, then choose to do better. It was not justice he had sought. Only remembrance. And now, Lillian's resting place stood not as a site of conflict, but as a quiet monument to grace, forged not in violence, but in standing still, when the world told him to move. By the time summer heat rolled over Arlington, the small patch of earth where Lillian Mallory rested had transformed. The grave, once just another orderly rectangle among many, now bore silent witness to a broader reckoning. Flowers arrived daily, some from strangers, others from former students, Navy personnel, nurses, and teachers. Messages were tucked under vases, scribbled on folded notes, sometimes no more than a single word: respect. Thank you. Scene. The Department of Veterans Affairs, in coordination with the Secretary of the Navy, arranged for an engraved bronze plaque to be installed beside the standard headstone. It bore both Lillian's name and Henry's. The inscription, simple and unembellished, read: "Service without applause. Love without condition." Though Henry had recovered physically from the incident, bruises fading, bones healing, something quieter in him had shifted. At home, the television stayed off. Newspapers piled by the door. He spent most days on the porch with a mug of cold coffee, the crucifix around his neck again, Lillian's rocking chair sitting still beside him like an unbroken silence. Yet, people came. A steady stream of visitors, some scheduled, some arriving with nothing more than hope, made their way to his modest home outside D.C. An old ranch-style place with flaking paint and sun-warped shutters, it became an unlikely pilgrimage site. They brought stories instead of gifts. A woman from Kentucky said she became a civil rights lawyer after reading about Lillian's field clinics. A Navy pilot credited Henry's sonar analysis with saving his father's convoy in the Gulf of Tonkin. Most visitors stayed just long enough to shake Henry's hand, share a name, and leave changed. He never said much in return. He'd nod, sometimes pat a shoulder, but more often he just looked into their eyes for a long moment. That was enough. He had always believed that presence said what words couldn't. One afternoon, Rear Admiral Baines returned, this time without ceremony. She wore jeans and a plain black t-shirt, hair pulled back, face softer than the one America had seen on the news. She sat on the porch beside him. No speeches today, she said. Henry chuckled, low and gravelly. Good. They sat in silence, letting the cicadas fill the space. Eventually, she pulled out a small envelope. It's from the Secretary of the Navy. Official commendation. Civilian honor for lifetime service. He didn't reach for it. Put it inside. Somewhere Lillian won't see it and say, took them long enough. Joanna laughed, slipping it into her bag instead. Congress is still holding hearings, she added. The contractor's been dismissed. There's talk of a new code of conduct for cemetery enforcement. Real oversight this time. Good, he said simply. A week later, a group of Langston High alumni hosted a memorial lecture in Lillian's honor. They named the school's new library after her, the Lillian Mallory Center for Healing and History. A mural inside depicted her administering medicine in a war tent, Henry behind her holding a textbook. He didn't attend the unveiling. Too many cameras. Too many forced smiles. But he sent a handwritten note. It read, "Let them learn. Let them remember." Another morning brought a letter from a boy in Minneapolis. 10 years old. He wrote, "Dear Mr. Mallory, I saw you on TV and my mom said you used to be a teacher. I think it was mean what they did to you. I hope I grow up to be like you. Also, I'm sorry your wife died. You look like you loved her very much." Henry read the letter 3 times. Then he put it in the drawer beside his bed, where he'd also placed the folded flag, still wrapped in plastic to keep out dust. He never unwrapped it. Some things, he said, were too full of weight to be undone. The VA assigned a counselor to check in weekly. She was gentle, young, and smart enough to know not to push. She asked questions, but Henry often sat through the visits in silence, offering only a shrug or a nod. When she asked what made his wife so special, he finally spoke. She didn't need a stage, he said. She made people better without needing credit for it. That's love. That's the real fight. He looked at her then, eyes steady. And they almost buried her in chaos. The counselor nodded, understanding the weight of what was nearly lost. News cycles moved on. Headlines shifted. The video still circulated, occasionally resurfacing during Veterans Day or Memorial Day broadcasts. But the deeper legacy was slower, more subtle. A few new training modules were added to Homeland Security's private contractor onboarding program, one focused entirely on compassion and context in protected spaces. Henry's story was now required reading. Students across the country began using the incident in classroom debates on civil rights, federal authority, and systemic bias. It wasn't part of the national curriculum, but teachers brought it in anyway. And then one fall morning, a young officer in training at the U.S. Naval Academy stood during a seminar and asked, "Are we taught enough about those who serve quietly?" His professor paused, then mentioned Henry by name. Back in his house, Henry sat with a shoebox full of old photographs. One showed Lillian in her nurse's cap, her smile wide and fierce. Another showed them both young, standing in front of a church the day after they were married, fingers entwined. He stared at the photo for a long time, then said out loud, "They remember you now." Outside, the wind stirred the porch swing. The crucifix around his neck gleamed in the sunlight. One evening, weeks later, he walked with a cane to Lillian's grave alone. A young volunteer saw him and started to approach, but Henry raised one hand gently, not to push away, but to ask for privacy. He stood there for a long time. When he finally knelt, it was with great care. He placed something small in the grass, a card from that 10-year-old boy. Then, with both hands, he traced her name in the stone. "Still here," he whispered. "Still holding your hand." And the wind answered in rustling leaves. Where injustice had tried to silence, memory now spoke louder. Where harm had struck, legacy healed. And in the quiet afterward, what remained was not anger, but grace. Still standing.